Okay, welcome everyone. It is 6 o'clock. So we are going to get started since we budgeted an hour for this session, and we have a great presentation from our speaker. My name is Laura Estandia. I'm the Executive Director of Bike Miami Valley. We are the region's bike advocacy organization. Our mission is to advocate, promote, and create opportunities for cycling in our region. Today's presentation is part of our winter webinar series. We framed this as a content extra because it does technically focus on pedestrians, but we are big fans of Angie Schmitt's work. We believe that a lot of what she writes about in her book, Right of Way, pertains to people who bike as well, some of the same vulnerabilities. And we know that when we plan for pedestrians, our roads are safer for people on bikes and people in cars. So we're super excited to host her in this conversation. So after her presentation, I'm happy to say that this event is sponsored by the Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission, and we'll have Matt Lindsay, who is here, speak about some crash data that MVRPC collects as one of their services to our region, and also some pedestrian resources that they provide. So they're going to give a little bit of local context for us. So thank you again, MVRPC, for sponsoring. A couple items of business here. During the course of the presentation, we do ask you to keep yourself muted. We are also actively recording this session. We will end the recording before our discussion time. You are welcome to ask questions in the chat throughout the presentation that we will review and ask of either Angie or Matt. You can also raise your hand in the reactions area of your toolbar. There is an option to raise your hand if you would like to ask your question verbally. And with that, I will introduce our speaker, Angie Schmitt. Angie was the longtime national editor at Streetsblog. Her writing and commentary have appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, and NPR. She is the founder of the new firm, 3MPH Planning and Consulting, a small Cleveland-based firm which is focused on pedestrian safety. And she is going to present today on the pedestrian safety crisis in America, why it's happening, and what we can do about it. Angie, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Thanks, Matt. I'm really excited to be here in Dayton for the second time today. I did another presentation earlier, and this is a presentation I've been traveling around the country giving. It gets into the topic of my book, which you can see right here, Right of Way. It was published in August. So I've spoken with probably a few thousand people about it at this point around the country. And I think there's lessons for every city, including Dayton. Okay, so this presentation is about what I call the pedestrian safety crisis in the United States. And so just real quick overview, I'm gonna talk about the history, sort of the problem, who's getting killed, where, and then there's a whole section where I'm just gonna sort of geek out about cars. So I just wanna warn you about that. And then we'll talk about solutions. Okay, so this is a picture of Euclid Avenue in Cleveland in 1930. It's sort of our main street downtown. And this is sort of at the dawn of the auto era in the United States. You can see there's a few cars already on the street here, but the city still primarily at this time revolved around streetcars. You can see one thing, I just want to point out a couple things about this photo. Notice how many pedestrians are on the sidewalks, and also notice that in this picture there are no crosswalks. Pedestrians just sort of are free to be wherever they want to be on the street and are pretty relaxed crossing the street. So historically, moving ahead, streets were places of varied activities. One of the big uses was kids would play in the street. And here, this is not in Cleveland, but it just shows, at the time, I think this is a little amusement ride that pulled up on the street. merchants would sell goods in the street. They, you would pause and talk with a neighbor. But all that sort of changed around this era. And now there's a guy named Peter Norton that wrote a book about this. Some of you might be familiar with this. Groups like City Lab and that kind of thing have written a lot about this. But there was this campaign around this time when cars started flooding into cities in the late 1930s, when the Model T Ford was invented. They started killing a lot of people, and sort of the history that's been told popularly is that there was this sort of frictionless adoption of the auto vehicle in the United States as the main form of transportation. But actually, there was a good deal of it was pretty controversial when it first started happening, and there was a organized political opposition that called for sort of limiting the domain of cars in the city. So in response, there was this group, and Peter Norton calls it motordom in the book, but it was, people who were organized, auto interest supporters, fuel sellers, auto dealers, auto clubs. And they started this campaign, and they introduced this notion of the jaywalker. So back at that time, like calling someone a jay was sort of a derogatory insult. So they kind of implied they invented this idea that pedestrians should only be able to cross at intersections, and even then only when there wasn't any traffic. And they introduced this idea, and it took a lot of effort. You can see this is was a pamphlet that was distributed in Cincinnati in 1952. They would have Boy Scout troops and that type of thing distribute these. Anyway, that campaign, we all know which side won out in this battle. If you can just go ahead, that concept was adopted by the federal government and now has really changed the way we think about who streets are for. And so here's another picture in Cleveland. I have to point out, this is a different street. This is Carnegie Avenue, but still notice the difference over just 16 years time. You don't see any pedestrians at all on the street, and the entire road right of way is for cars, and anyone who enters it is at risk of being killed and blamed for it. So moving on, this is just an illustration. It's done the rounds a lot. It's by a Swedish artist on the internet, but I think it sort of illustrates just how marginalized pedestrians have become. So that's sort of where we are today. That brings us up to speed. Okay, so when I talk about the pedestrian safety crisis in the United States, this is what I'm talking about. In about the past 10 years, we've seen this big increase in pedestrian deaths. We now have about 50% more than we did a little over a decade ago. So this is a sort of a sustained trend, but it is pretty unusual for traffic deaths to increase. Since about the 1970s, we've seen a more or less steady decline on most metrics. So when this first started happening at the early part of the last decade, a lot of experts thought it was a fluke or just didn't really know what to make of it. But now it's pretty entrenched. We know this is a sustained trend. So I'm going to try and explain why this is happening. And first of all, I just want to say, again, getting into a little bit about who's getting killed. I think some of the media coverage about this topic has been kind of problematic. And one of the sort of stereotypes or tropes you see a lot has been advanced is this idea of like the distracted pedestrian. And I think there's sort of a stereotype about who's getting killed in a lot of people's minds. And it's sort of like this guy here on the left. And he's, excuse me, he's like a wired millennial and he's crossing at a crosswalk in maybe a major city like DC. But that's really not a very good representation of who's being killed. It's really much more like this guy over here on the right, who sort of looks like maybe he's a lower income guy. He's sort of racing across this big, wide suburban arterial that doesn't even have a crosswalk at that location. That's a place I shot that in suburban Cleveland. So I think that sort of stereotype, it goes back a little bit to privilege a little bit. I think, this is a problem that has a lot to do with inequality. And the kind of people who are sort of writing media columns and that kind of thing, they might be encountering and noticing the guy on the left on their commute into work, and they're not put in the position of the guy on the right who's having to sort of race across the street very much. So again, getting back to this issue of privilege and inequality. This is an issue that's a little bit like coronavirus, whereas you might think it would impact everyone equally, but if you start digging into the data, a lot of these um, societal issues, racism start to show up in the data. So again, a little bit like Corona, this is an issue that affects people of color disproportionately. Hispanic folks are at increased risk. Black folks almost twice as likely to be killed this way, and Native folks are at 4.5 times the risk. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, why that is later in the presentation. Um, Other marginalized groups are also at increased risk. So one group I want to talk about a little bit is older adults. So when people who are aging, the United States is aging very rapidly right now. So this is a big growing part of our population. People 50 plus, people 75 plus. These are fast growing demographic groups. And you can see that the risk of being killed this way begins to increase when people are 50. And by the time they're 75 or older, they're twice as likely to be killed while walking. So a couple things about this. This is not a group we've done a very good job of planning for. A lot of our, like for example, a lot of our traffic signals, the walk signal may be timed so that, a fit man at middle age can get across safely, but someone who moves a little bit slower, someone who uses a mobility device, they may be left out sort of in the middle of the intersection by that walk signal when traffic starts racing through. So we have to do a better job planning for older adults, especially as that group grows. And additionally, one thing I wanted to say about this is the growth in these demographic groups may be part of the reason we're seeing an increase in pedestrian deaths altogether. Some groups like the CDC predicted as early as 10 years ago that because of the aging of the American population, we'd have increasing pedestrian deaths. And that seems to be right. Okay. So moving on to where people are being killed. This is a map. It shows here in purple the most dangerous states for pedestrians, and then in green the safest. And you probably notice almost without exception that most dangerous states are in the southeast, the Sun Belt region of the United States. And the reason for that is if you think back to the first two pictures, certain cities in the Northeast were pretty well developed in 1930, including Cleveland, including Dayton. Dayton had, a very sophisticated streetcar system. A lot of the city and even the suburbs, maybe a few of the inner ring suburbs, were designed around a streetcar system and retain a little bit of a walkable structure, land use type of thing. But that's not the case for a lot of these communities, especially in Florida and Texas, that saw most of their growth, after the invention of the automobile, sort of at the height of the auto era in the United States. I'm sorry, after the invention of air conditioning. So these are places that tend to be much more sprawling. They have wider roads, very hostile to pedestrians in a lot of cases. Oh, one thing I want to mention about that as well. So again, when we talk about demographic changes in the United States, one of the trends that's contributing to this problem probably is the fact that those southern states are capturing the lion's share of population growth in the United States during the past decade and prior to that. So unfortunately, it's not, as far as this issue goes, it's not the San Franciscos and Portlands and New Yorks that are really seeing a lot of population growth. It's more the Houstons, the Fort Lauderdales, some of the most dangerous places in the United States. Okay, so I talked a little bit earlier about how this is an issue that is related to racism. And I'm using Cleveland as an example here, but this is, again, the kind of thing we see probably pretty much in any metro area. I just want to talk a little bit about demographic change and segregation and how it's related. So this shows anyone who's familiar with Cleveland, it shows racial segregation in Cleveland. Green is where Black people live. Orange is where white people live, and yellow areas are places that are a little more diverse. So this shows Cleveland in 1990, very segregated, obviously. If we move ahead though, 20 years, this is about 10 years ago. I don't have the latest census data. I would expect this trend would be more pronounced. And obviously Cleveland is still pretty segregated, and that's bad. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is we're seeing a lot more diversity in the suburbs. This is a national pattern, and actually a lot more pronounced in growing metro areas. Like in Atlanta, you would see this trend would be a lot more exaggerated. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is our suburban areas are becoming more diverse, both racially and economically. There's this concept that gets talked about a little bit, and probably a lot of people have heard of, called the suburbanization of poverty. And been a really big thing over the last decade. So there's a lot of growth in suburban areas that really weren't designed for people who rely on the bus, people who rely on walking, have now become places where a lot of people who are lower income live. And it puts them in a pretty dangerous position. Okay, so again, back to racism and the way that plays into this. So again, that previous map showed racial segregation in Cleveland. Now here are the most dangerous road segments in Cleveland. And if you look, they match up almost exactly to concentrations of people of color, neighborhoods of color in Cleveland. So again, that's pretty typical. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but we see that in most cities where neighborhoods of color have the most dangerous roads. Now, in this example, I'm going to use Portland's. This is a map they produced of, it shows 2 years of traffic fatalities, and it's kind of a cool map. I think they use the names of the victims to sort of humanize the issue. But as you can see, the traffic deaths don't occur sort of in an arbitrary pattern. There's a clear concentration over here on the right side of the map. So what's going on there? So I don't know how, probably not a lot of people are familiar with Portland, but the important thing to know is in Portland, they have this big dividing line right here, 82nd Street. And yep, so everything east of 82nd Street in Portland is called East Portland. And East Portland is poorer and it's more diverse than the rest of the city. So if you look at this map shows, it might be kind of hard to read, but it shows the top 30 highest crash intersections. 28 out of 30 are in East Portland. And in Portland, about a quarter of the city's population lives in East Portland, but it accounts for about half of traffic deaths. So people living there are twice as likely to be killed this way. Okay, just real quickly, I'm using this as an example of how like racism would play out potentially in an infrastructure decision. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, Native folks are at really, really heightened risk, are almost 5 times as likely to be killed while walking. So we don't fully understand why that is, but one of the reasons is seems to be that tribal lands and reservations are places where a lot of walking happens, even though they're in kind of rural locations. So they might function a little bit like a traditional village where people are doing a lot of trips by walking, but this is the kind of infrastructure conditions they're encountering. And this was shot by some researchers at the University of Minnesota, and it shows some paths worn in the grass between, on one side there's a food cellar, and on the other side there's a tribal service center for this tribe. So as you can see, the residents are having to walk up these dirt paths, no sidewalks, no curb ramps, and then cross a high-speed rural road that has no crosswalk, no traffic lights. So these researchers, they interviewed people who lived on the reservation. They interviewed like tribal elders and visitors and residents, and they also interviewed people from the state DOT. And so the tribal residents, when they were interviewed about transportation issues, were bringing up pedestrian safety all the time. It was the #1 concern. But when they interviewed the folks at the DOT, they almost never brought it up. And even when they were pressed on it, they just sort of defaulted to behavioral explanations that sort of blamed the victims. So I think this is an example of something that happens a lot, where there's just not enough respect for local knowledge of the problem, and especially if the transportation officials, you know, are from a different culture, they might not really understand local concerns very well. And it's very important that those concerns be listened to and respected. And we also have to do a better job in the industry of representation. Okay, so I warned you guys about this. I'm going to switch gears and talk about cars because um, we already covered, there's a few things going on. The American population is aging, for one, so we're more vulnerable. Two, people are living in more dangerous areas. They're more likely to live in the Sun Belt. They're more likely to be out in suburbs. Um, Thirdly, cars are getting more dangerous. So this is a big trend that's important to talk about. Um, and if we look back to about 2010, when we were coming out of the last recession, but about a decade ago, about 3 in 4 new cars being sold were sedans. But over the last decade, that completely reversed. For the most recent model year, about 3 in 4 new cars were SUVs or pickups. So there's been this complete reversal, and that plays a big role. Just to point out here, these two sort of similar cars, we're sort of trading this gray car here on the right for this white car here on the left, even though they have sort of similar seating capacity. Maybe the white car has a little more cargo room, but just notice how much bigger the white car is. So that turns out it has a big impact on what happens when a pedestrian is struck by a car. So I'm just using myself for scale here, but I'm about 5'6". So I'm like a medium height woman. This car here on the left, this Honda Civic, would sort of hit me in the legs. Whereas this Toyota 4Runner over here on the right would hit me sort of in the abdomen or the chest. So getting hit in the legs is bad by a car, of course, but having that impact to your right towards your internal organs is more dangerous. And there's pretty clear data that this is contributing to the problem. The Federal Highway Administration released a report in 2015 saying that pedestrians struck by SUVs were 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be killed. And children are as much as 4 times as likely to be killed because they would then be hit in the head. So again, that was a little bit about SUVs, but we also have pickup trucks becoming increasingly enormous and scary looking. I used my son here, who was 4 at the time, sort of just for scale. This is a parked car, but it's a lifted Ford F-250. You can see they not only do they look really scary, they create these big blind zones that can obscure children. Children are backed over quite frequently in the United States. The numbers are pretty alarming. About 50 children every week in the United States are backed over at slow speeds because they're in the blind zones of cars like this. So that is another issue. Okay, so real quickly, I just want to walk you through, I'll just do a time check, the evolution of one of these cars. This is RAV4 in 1996. This is I use this car because it's the #1 selling vehicle in America outside of pickups. So if you look back to 1996, it used to just be sort of like a tall Toyota Corolla, kind of tiny and cute. And if we move forward 2009, you can see how much bigger it gets. It adds like 800 pounds almost on the low end. A little bit meaner, face. And then to 2019, or yeah, this is one of the most recent versions. And it's actually not a whole lot heavier, but I just think it's interesting to notice. Now it goes from having this cute sort of smiling face to this mean scowling face. So it's sort of a sad thing, but the auto industry seems to have really profited from this kind of antisocial impulse we have now. And I think it relates back to some of the issues we see in our culture, sort of a fraying of social ties. But I'm not going to get into that a lot. Another thing, and this is relevant to cyclists as well, that I thought was just worth mentioning real quickly. We also we have some issues with our large commercial vehicles as well. There's a lot of room for improvement. This shows the blind zones around like a typical commercial truck. And some of these, I mean, they're just really enormous. There's different, some graphics will show like a bike lane here with 10 or 15 people in it that would be totally obscured. So this is the kind of thing we could resolve pretty easily with some cameras and mirrors, but we just haven't required that. So we let cars with these really, or I'm sorry, commercial trucks with really enormous blind zones just drive it right into the center of our most crowded cities, and a lot of people get killed as a result. Okay, so now I'm gonna change gears for the last time to solutions. I feel like I'm going a little long, so I might try to sort of rush through this. But this is Queens Boulevard in New York, and it's just sort of an example of a success story. And then, you know, you guys are probably all familiar with this concept of a road diet, and that's what this is. It's a really important strategy for reducing these kind of deaths to all kinds of users. Oh, I'm sorry. So Queens Boulevard. This is a road. 189 people were killed on this road between 1996 and 2014. So this is the kind of road where they're having 10, maybe 10 plus deaths on the single road every year. But as you can see, in around 2014, they overhauled the road. They invested a relatively small amount of money, about 12 to 14 million dollars, and they added this protected bike lane, and they also added a bus lane over there on the right. And after that, deaths fell off a cliff. It was several years before they had any more deaths. There have been a few. There have been a small handful since then, but they went from having, again, like as many as 10 plus deaths a year to none for several years. So it's a big success story. And real quickly, almost every city has a road like this, or maybe you have multiple roads where there are disproportionate killers, where a high percentage of your traffic deaths happen. Often we call these suburban arterials, and the most dangerous roads are usually they're bus routes, they have retail, they may have low income housing. So there's a lot of destinations, but also, you know, a lot of lanes and high speeds. Those are the most dangerous roads. So one thing New York has done that's really cool is this concept called a leading pedestrian interval. And all that means is that they retime their traffic lights so that pedestrians get a few seconds head start on traffic. So they also, and in addition, they add this thing called a hard and center line, which in this case, you know, very cheap, easy thing. They're just putting a couple bollards there. And what that does is it forces cars making left turns to slow down and make a sharper left turn and not cut the angle so much. So left turns are very dangerous, both to drivers and pedestrians. So slowing those down and making sure pedestrians are out sort of in the middle of the intersection when those turns begin is a really effective strategy. And it's helped reduce pedestrian fatalities there about 40%. And it only costs about $1,200 per intersection. They've done it at more than 1,000 intersections in New York. Okay. Here's another thing I want to talk about real quickly, another success story. And does anyone want to chime in and tell me what cities these are? Give me a breather. Does anyone want to just yell that out? I'm going to give up on that in like 1 second if no one chimes in. Yes. Keegan says it's Cleveland, Toledo, and Detroit. And you even got Toledo. I appreciate that. So yeah, Detroit up here, Toledo over here, Cleveland where I live over here. So this was shot from space at night. And I'm sorry, I keep forgetting you guys can't see my mouse. But one thing to note about this is how Detroit looks a little bit bluer and Cleveland down here is a little bit yellower. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that. That's a big success story because about 75% of pedestrian deaths occur at night. So street lighting is a really important issue to consider. So in Detroit, they did a survey around 2012, 2013, and they found out that about 40% of their streetlights weren't functioning. They had broken for whatever reason, they weren't working. So if we could just move up to the next slide. But they decided to do something about it, and they teamed up with the state, and they issued $185 million in bonds, and they got all their streetlights working, and they switched over to LED lights. So that's why it looks blue compared to Cleveland in the photo. Okay, so they got them all repaired here in where this blue arrow is at the bottom. Between 2014 and 2016, they replaced and repaired all the streetlights. And you can see this map of pedestrian fatalities, what happens as soon as those are done, those are in place. Pedestrian deaths dropped about 35% immediately over just 2 years. And this blue portion at the top of this bar graph, that shows deaths occurring in dark, unlighted conditions. Those go from they're having as many as 26 in 2013 to going down to having just one in 2016 and 2017. So those pretty much stop happening. And this is especially impressive given that over this same period, we see pedestrian deaths rising in other places. They managed to really reduce theirs with that intervention. Detroit's doing some other cool things. I use it's funny because I do this presentation around the country and I use like Portland as a bad example and Detroit as a good example, but they're just being kind of ambitious about this. This is something I really like. They're installing 4,500 speed humps, or that's the goal in 2021. It's like a super cheap intervention, only $11.5 million. So I think that's exciting and cool. Because I'm sure a lot of you know this, but speed is really important. Controlling speed is really important. And when we're talking about traffic safety and saving people's lives and reducing these serious injuries, this is just a graphic I borrowed from ProPublica, but at 40 miles per hour, about 70% of people struck at that speed who are 70 years old are going to be killed. But if we can lower the speed to 30 or even just 25, the odds are so much lower. They drop below 50%, almost to about 25%. So even just a few miles per hour reduction can really increase people's chances of living when they're struck. Okay, and I made it. Here's my last slide. This is an example. I feel like this is not a very sexy type of intervention, but this is the kind of thing I would love to see more of. It's a mid-block crossing that has a pedestrian refuge island. This is called here. And like I mentioned, I think it's kind of unsexy. They're not very expensive. This is a nice one. It's accessible. It's landscaped, but these can cost just a few $1,000s to install. And the city of Pittsburgh is doing some cool stuff with these where they're just constructing them sort of out of bollards for next to nothing. But that gives people a safe place to wait in the middle of the road. And it doesn't, in this case, it doesn't take space away from cars. There's no war on cars issue that people can really get mad about. So I don't think it's very controversial either. The Federal Highway Administration recommends these and they say they reduce pedestrian crashes about 35%. But it's sort of just a matter of resources and will. And I think that's really what's lacking. We don't lack sort of design interventions to help us with this problem. It's really, we have sort of inertia about the way we've done things in the past. And I also think part of the problem is that a lot of us, myself included, who are in positions of more influence, are kind of privileged. And we don't find ourselves in the real dangerous situations like that guy I showed in one of the first slides who's just sort of racing across the street. But there's a lot of opportunities for this kind of thing, for these kind of improvements throughout cities. And I think it's the kind of thing that could really improve quality of life. Like I would love to see these added in front of every school. You know, how many more parents would feel comfortable letting their kids walk to school if at the one or two kind of scary roads there was something like this to really ensure kids could get to school safer. So that's just how I'm going to kind of wrap it up. I think we've got to do my spiel and my book. I'm trying to sort of elevate this issue so we can sort of give this issue more thought and find a will to build safer places, especially for the folks that are most vulnerable. And with that, I just have a final slide, and it's just like a plug for my book. If anyone wants to read more, you can find it at your local bookseller. You can order it right now, or if you want, you can have a discount code using my last name through the publisher, and that's Island Press, and that's a link there. And that's sort of it. I think Matt's gonna talk a little bit now, and then we're gonna do questions.
Thanks, Angie. That's really fascinating stuff. So I'm going to share with you all just some of the safety and data resources that are available through the Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission. We do transportation planning for a 3+ county area: Miami, Montgomery, Greene County, and Northern Warren. And we have a sister agency in Springfield that does Clark County, and they do similar things. So next slide, please. We analyze crashes on a 3-year rotating basis. Our most recent report is 14 through 16, and we have a 17 through 19 report that is due soon. We do it for many reasons. We monitor the crash trends. We want to find those locations and segments that have high crash rates so that we can direct our resources, our transportation dollars, towards making roadway safety improvements. Next slide, please. So in that 3-year period, there were just under 59,000 crashes. Next slide. But because of the ways our dollars are allowed to be spent, we primarily study the crashes that occur on the functionally classified roads. So we're not ignoring, but we're not taking a close look at crashes that occur like in parking lots or in residential areas. So for the purposes of this study, we looked at about 44,500 crashes. Next. And of these crashes, you can see how we break them out by property damage only, and then injury causing crashes, which are in the yellow, and then the fatal crashes, of which during those 3 years in our region, there were 205 fatal crashes. Okay, next. What that works out to is about 2 crashes an hour, and a fatal crash about every 5 days for those 3 years in our region. Again, next. So how do we compare with the state and the country in terms of crash rates per 100 million miles traveled? We have a higher rate than the country, but a lower rate than the state as a whole. So, and that's a pretty consistent finding over the years. Next. Bike and ped crashes, of particular interest to this group, of course. Bike and ped crashes turn out to be a very small percentage of total crashes, 1.5%, but a very high percentage of the fatal crashes, almost 1 in 5. So they are disproportionately severe events, not surprisingly, because they are vulnerable road users. Failure to yield, and I believe that means by either the cyclist or the motorist or the pedestrian, is the leading top contributing factor in any of these bicycle or pedestrian crashes. Next. So on our website, mvrpc.org, you can look at our transportation safety page and download a much more complete version of our safety study. Sometime this spring, we'll have the more updated, the more recent 3-year period for you to look at as well. And there are some other resources you can check out on that page as well. Next, I think it goes into yes. So we mapped out what we concluded, and I'm not the person who worked on this, so I'm telling you it's there, but I can't answer a lot of detailed questions about it. 362 high crash locations, including intersections and segments on the road, and then ranked them by high, medium, and low frequency of crashes. And then next. We also did a pedestrian crash risk assessment. So this doesn't rely on past history of pedestrian crashes in a location, but it looks at factors that, many of which that Angie talked about, factors which lead one to conclude that this location or this segment of a road would be a more likely location for high crash, for pedestrian crashes. And that includes things like it being a suburban arterial, being in a neighborhood with a higher percentage of people without, households without automobiles, being in a higher percentage neighborhood of, or being near a school or other pedestrian attractor. And so this tool or this map that we've created in partnership with ODOT, I think is an image on the next slide. Yep. So you zoom into this, you can zoom into any of the locations that were assessed, and you can click on a segment or an intersection, and it will tell you what are the risk factors that are present at this intersection, and it rates the location or the segment from 0 to 10, 0 being lowest and 10 being the highest risk factor for a pedestrian crash. And it'll list out, as you can see on this slide, some of the factors that are involved in this particular location, which is North Main Street in Dayton, and with a risk score of 8.5, so that's pretty high on a scale of 0 to 10. And but you can go out. This analysis was done throughout our region, so you can. It's not just Dayton, so you can look in locations in your area, if you're not from Dayton, and to see what we found in terms of pedestrian risk. Again, this does not factor in past pedestrian crash history, and also I should emphasize, it doesn't factor in bicycle crashes, but we think it's reasonable to assume that some of these various factors that raise pedestrian crash risk are probably also factors in bicycle crash risk, with the exception of whether or not there's a bike facility there. So next slide. We also, because keeping the analysis of pedestrian and bicyclist safety is not just a data crunching number, but there's also a public education element to it as well. So we have a number of safety campaigns that we have and are continuing to circulate throughout the region, including on topics such as wearing your seatbelt, don't do distracted driving. Next slide, please. And also being visible at night. And we also have another one not shown on this slide, I believe, about using a car seat for children and infants. All factors, to reduce roadway crashes and injuries and deaths. So we have these campaigns that we've put them on billboards, on the sides of buses, radio, internet, streaming services, and other web digital platforms for seeing advertising. So we put these campaigns on a sort of a regular rotation in order to keep the public thinking about important safety messages. So next slide. Another service we offer is to do walking and biking audits. This is a great way to get on the ground, real-time assessment of the quality and the safety of the pedestrian or the bicycling environment within your community. It is a great way for city staff and even elected officials to do direct public engagement with their constituents from across the region. These are great ideas for meeting with the parents of a particular school if you're going to do a school zone, or the owners of businesses if you're looking at your downtowns, or community residents if you're looking at getting safer access to local parks or recreation facilities or public spaces. So if your community is interested in having a walking or a biking audit, I'm the one to contact for that. And MVRPC can help set that up and facilitate it for you and give you a report back about what feedback was received from the people who participated in the audit. So this is a fun and great way to learn more about your community. Next slide. These are some links to various pages on our website about transportation safety and the crash risk assessment, the pedestrian crash risk assessment study. You can put those sort of keywords in our search bar and find them, or just look under transportation from the main menu bar across our homepage, and you'll be able to find all this safety information pretty easily. Next slide. And I am now ready for questions, as well as Angie. How do we do? We got 15 minutes. We're doing great.
We are doing great. I did want to put in a quick plug for Bike Miami Valley. If you're interested in getting involved with our work, if you're passionate about this issue, we do want to hear from you at contact@bikemiamivalley.org. We also want to encourage folks to become members of Bike Miami Valley. You can become a general member or a member of one of our chapters in Piqua, Springfield, our newest one in Kettering, Centerville, and Yellow Springs. Chris is going to drop some links into the chat to the membership page and also our upcoming webinars on February 9th. We're doing a Q&A with the bike mechanic, and on March 9th, we're doing a panel on local bike touring. So please join us for that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we are going to enter into the Q&A portion of the event. I think we got some questions in the chat potentially. I'm going to stop the recording as well.